discussed. The legacy factors, the normal disengagement between the various levels of strategy, which mean that they end up being out of phase. The fact that the world changes so much that emergent strategy tends to be a significant component of the overall strategy process, and that CEOs often don't stick around to see their full strategies being fully implemented because it takes so long. The implementation is often much worse than the strategy design process. As Winston Churchill said, no matter how beautiful your strategy is, occasionally you should pause to take a look at how it's working. And that's very true. So what we're talking about here is a fairly straightforward and pragmatic component. However, in practice, it tends to be quite significant. And also, if you think about the resources, plan strategy in particular, or the decision to move to formalise emergent strategy requires relatively few resources compared to the resources consumed in making a major change, such as a structural change. So the organisation can decide to acquire a business unit as part of its corporate strategy. That's a relatively low-cost decision compared to the actual process of acquiring and absorbing that business unit. So not only is the difficulty often found mostly in the implementation, but so are the major costs. So it is a very critical area. And I've got the Winston Churchill quote there. What about that? All right, so the challenges, often we just really don't know how to deal with it. There are many change tools out there. They're not usually designed for the scope of strategy, and more importantly, the complication of the organisation due to its individual characteristics, its structure and its size, and the individual nature of the strategy means that there's going to be no proprietary tool because it's a one-off thing. It's a project. There's some background tools, but there's no overarching tools for most strategy implementation. And the more creative and innovative strategy, the less likely there is to be any tools. So, for example, you might have a very simple strategy of increasing your cost performance to become a stronger cost leader. There are a few reasonable tools around that, but that's also a very predictable strategy. It's not going to take the competition by surprise. If you decide to diversify into a new industry that didn't previously exist, like Elon Musk, or in fact Richard Branson, by saying, okay, we're going to move commercial flights from being within around between countries into outer space, then creating that whole new industry certainly does, is a very significant strategy. On the other hand, there are no tools for that. There are no tools for doing that sort of thing. So the more ambitious the strategy, the less the support that's available. Often the process of formulation, as I said, is a relatively straightforward process for most organisations compared to the implementation. It takes a relatively short amount of time relative to the many years associated with implementation. And naturally enough, therefore, because of the difference between the two processes, there tends to be a bit of disconnect. The strategy formulation process will make a range of assumptions which won't become apparent until perhaps even well into the implementation. So, for example, the strategy formulation might assume that the organisation's culture is sufficiently accepting for the changes required, and it may not be till halfway through that you discover, for various reasons, either internal or external, that the culture is in fact not accepting enough of that to adopt that change. And so there can easily be a disconnect between what was thought could happen and what becomes possible. Communication and commitment are key areas. Communication, getting the workforce to genuinely understand what the organisation is about, with the exception of a few highly committed leaders, the best example of which I think is Stan Walton, who spent as CEO and owner of Walmart, spent most of his time in the position going from shop to shop, literally from each of his shops, speaking to the staff and saying personally to them, directly from the CEO to the line staff, this is what we're about. And he spent most of his time driving around, seeing the people in the stores to explain what they were trying to do. So, which is something that most CEOs won't undertake. But apart from that, communication of strategic processes tends to be difficult. Why? Because there's, as you know from your own studies, there is a massive volume of information flowing around organisations as it is. Most of it goes through regular formal channels such as reporting and other predictable activities, which you focus on because you know that important information is coming through those. Unstructured, occasional and event-based information such as a strategy implementation or such as some other event tends to get missed, so most people won't pick that up. The other issue is commitment, and doesn't necessarily even need to be personal commitment, but rather the nature of the way things are done in most organisations. Everybody has their KPIs, everyone has a performance expectation. Those performance expectations are specified. Inevitably, the strategy is not any different to those, but may indeed be in opposition. So individuals are faced with a complicated situation that on one level, their personal commitment needs to be to their KPI so that they can sustain their performance and be viewed to be a good employee. On the other hand, they're also being asked to do something which is different to or possibly even contrary to those things. And they realise it's for the good of the organisation, but nevertheless, no one goes through and eliminates the first set of KPIs, freeing them up to do that. So an organisation that has focused on the contribution of its employees to differentiation through customer service, innovation and quality, which implements a strategy of cost cutting to become more cost competitive, will put all the managers in a very awkward position because on one hand, all of their KPIs are around how they support their staff and how they invest in the staff and how they encourage their staff to contribute more, whilst a strategy is being implemented at the same time, which is asking them to reduce the amount of support for the staff, perhaps reduce staff levels and cut costs where they can. And so they'll find themselves torn between these two competing sets of objectives. So lack of commitment for structural and job design reasons is a very serious barrier to strategy implementation. And so then, of course, we get up to the higher level where before we're talking about the individual level where it applies to everyone in the organisation, then where there are key stakeholders, the ones who are really going to push the strategy through, the holders of the information, the holders of various forms of power and influence, political power and knowledge, the individuals responsible for large portions of the workforce, the ones who are going to be able to implement the change that's required, have the same situation, but instead of just applying to themselves, it applies to their whole area of responsibility. So again, their area of responsibility may have one set of objectives and the strategy may require some different outcomes which are in conflict with the day-to-day set of objectives. And so then they have the very difficult decision as to whether they continue with the job function as it is described or the function of their area as it is described, or the strategy. Can they manage both? No, which is the correct one. They know in the historically and possibly into the future that their performance of their area will be assessed on the basis of the existing criteria rather than strategy. And so there's tremendous pressure for them to say, we're just going to continue to do business as usual because I can't add the strategic requirements to this and I'm not prepared to walk away from the fundamental responsibilities. So, and so you can imagine a situation perhaps in marketing, where marketing was a key component, and the organisation says that we're going to move to an entire new market, and the case that we're going to look at today is a bit like that. And so we have to bring all of these people in who weren't our customers in the past. So we're going to really focus on them and we're going to do many things differently for them. Great. So then marketing looks at the situation. But all our money comes from the other group. It's our responsibility to continue to bring in advertising, promotion and all of these other things from our traditional market. And you're suggesting that you want me to stop supporting that traditional market and invest all of our resources and time in this new market that we don't even understand. So what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to really just walk away from our existing market and let our revenue drive up? Am I supposed to try and split my resources half and half? How do I do this? And so the misalignment of the goals of the marketing department, for example, and the strategy in this example, create more than tensions, they create impossible positions. And so the obvious consequence is that the marketing department makes a bit of a commitment to the strategy because the CEO comes and speaks to the marketing director, or they have discussions with the board. So the marketing department knows they can't avoid supporting the strategy, but they're not going to just throw everything into the strategy in the way that the strategy really requires, because they have competing goals. Often there is more of a focus on analysing what's going on than actually implementing, so organisations can spend too long developing their strategy and not be actually ready and not consider how it's implemented. So they can look at a level of detail of how it would work once it's been done, but not actually put much planning into the actual process of achieving that particular change. And then, of course, during the course of the strategy design and certainly during the implementation, the world will change. There will be disruptions, there will be political events, there will be economic events, all of which change the deal upon which any strategic plans were based. All right, so let's now quickly go through some of the content in more detail. Learning outcomes, we have a set of criteria there which I want to focus on for for conducting an analysis of how the strategy is likely to perform. So this is, if you like, a checklist to determine whether or how the implementation is likely to work. So a strategy can be designed, but then the implementability is a critical assessment of the quality of that strategy. Now, at this point, yes, and so this is particularly well described in the text. We'll deal with it relatively briefly, but there's a lot more content behind each of these categories than we can deal with today. And it brings me to a point that I'll make this week and again next week. Now that for almost all of you the assignment is done and it's really time to start preparing for the exam. I think a lot of people have been viewing and absorbing what's been said, but haven't really taken a critical study role. And to do well in the exam, you need to move up a level to a level of critical perspective. And so that means more than just listening to the lectures and reviewing the lecture slides. It means taking a bit of proactive study in this unit, because there is a reasonable amount of material. It is a broad subject. And so I want to draw your attention to two areas that you really need to make sure you review, and I will be starting now. If you try and cram it in just before the exam, you're going to get a terrible headache and find it really hard to absorb the material. So one, of course, is the textbook. The textbook explains in detail what we deal with briefly in the lectures. So the lecture content cannot, in the 3 hours, cover the breadth of material in the text. But to answer the questions properly in the exam, you do need a greater level of breadth than the lectures provide. So you do need to look at the material as it's described in the text. So if you haven't already bought a text, you can buy a second-hand copy. That will have to be the previous edition, but it's predominantly similar. And few slight changes of chapter names, a little bit of rearrangement, but the content is probably about 90% similar. So get a second-hand copy of the textbook. There are a number of e-copies in the library. I don't know what the license is. It's obviously not enough for everyone, but there are some copies there as well. There's also copies of the older versions of the textbook in the library, but do go through the material, do read. It explains it in much greater detail than, as I said, we're able to do in the lectures. And the content of the slides, bullet points like this, don't provide full depth of understanding. So have a look at the text, the examples, and work on some of the practice problems in the test so that you're actually ready for the exam and actually able to answer a question. It's one thing to look at the information and say, oh yes, I think I know that. It's another thing to be able to answer a question about it. That's a separate skill. So make sure you use the questions and answers in the text. Yep. Oh, so there's problems relating to each of the chapters. Yeah, those stuff. Yeah. So make sure you're actually able to physically practice writing answers, because that's, as I said, a separate skill. Marshalling your thoughts. Think about how much time you've got in the exam. In this case, as I'll explain as we get close to the exam, there's 5 questions to do in 2 hours. So you don't have very long, but you've got about 25 minutes or so for each question. So you don't have that long, so you need to practice being able to actually get a cogent answer down in that time. So that's one thing, and the other thing is the readings as well. I've put a number of readings together for this unit, and they again give you a bit of breadth. They give you some stimulus material, they give you some ideas, and so you really need to have a look at those as well in terms of preparation for the exam. So I'm going to encourage you to do those. I find that each year when people come to see me because they did very poorly in the exam and they were a bit sort of horrified and obviously haven't passed the unit, you know, I asked them what they did, and the number one thing they did was not enough breadth of preparation. They would say, yes, I looked at the lecture slides, what else did you look at? Nothing else. And so the evidence is very clear that just looking at the lecture slides is not going to get you past the exam. So practice answering, make sure you get the full depth by looking at the textbook, and enhance that further by looking at the readings. And then you're in a strong position to be able to talk thoroughly about these topics rather than superficially. So I'll bring that up again next week, but I just thought I'd mention that now because this SAFE criteria is a great example of that. There is no way in the context of the lecture that I can give this the depth of discussion that's really required for you to be able to answer an exam question. I can only introduce the basic concepts. All right, so how do we identify strategies? Not terribly surprisingly, we look at how the organisation is doing. The strategy will have a very clearly set goal if it's a decent strategy, because why? It's a change to make things better. You don't make change for change's sake. You're trying to either strengthen the organisation of the future or improve its current performance. So we measure the economic performance and the organisational effectiveness as a lead factor for future performance. And we say, well, that was good, but we could do better, or we're still, you know, there are better, higher performing organisations in our industry, or we simply have more scope to improve. Then we look at what the options are, we use the SAFE criteria, and we implement them. So down at the bottom, can you see the mouse? Oh, you can, good. Down here, down in this area down here, we could have reformulate strategy and implement, and then we can reassess the performance again. Okay, so 2 types of measures. Obviously, the economic ones are about market share, profitability, sales growth, share price are all indicators of the historical indicators of the performance of the organisation. Lead indicators are internal effectiveness. You can use measures such as the balanced scorecard or triple bottom line economic performance to show how the internal operations are functioning, and if there is even a remote alignment between the strategy and the external environment, then good performance in those areas can be expected to improve the economic performance. Okay, that'll just make it a bit louder. A few people, or actually one person, mentioned that they're having a little bit of trouble with the sound on the recordings, so I've just bumped up a bit. All right, so how do we compare? Well, we set some targets. The targets are really should be a prediction of how the strategy is likely to affect the performance. So if the strategy, for example, is to diversify, and the assessment of the market is that it's equal and equivalent to the existing market that the organisation has, then you would expect to see sales double. And if you maintain sufficient efficiency, if it was perhaps a related diversification, and you expect to have the same efficiency in the new market that you had in the old market, then you would also expect profits to double as well, because it would generate as much profit from the new market as the old market. So organisational targets set in that sense are usually quite reasonable, probably not terribly ambitious. Frequently, however, organisational targets are set as stretch targets, which is a nice idea, but tends to be, in practice, often tend to be poorly thought about. And the reason is that stretch targets will end up being fairly specific. So they'll have a stretch target for this market segment in terms of profits and sales and so forth, and then for another segment. And so the organisation becomes a bit exhausted by setting all of these stretch targets. And as a result of that, some of them tend to be a bit on the sloppy side in practice. So stretch targets are good to stand in a little bit for strategy and say, look, we're not quite sure how we're going to do it. We know we're going to diversify into that market. We're not 100% sure exactly how we can compete. Cost seems a pretty good idea, but you never know. And are we targeting exactly the right costs? We can't be sure. So if we set a stretch target, it'll encourage emergent strategies to develop to help us head towards that. So the concept behind stretch targets is quite a good one, but as I said, in practice they tend to be thrown together fairly quickly without really detailed thought as to what can be achieved. Trends over time, obviously you want to see profits to continue to grow rather than be static, markets to share to grow if you can, and certainly sales volume to grow. Given that there is overall growth in the economy, you should expect to see growth in your size of your markets. And of course you can look at comparable organisations. How is everyone else doing? And clearly the target here is to become the leader in the industry if you can possibly do so. Unfortunately, however, then we again have a bit of reality which comes to play. The complexity of organisations, for example, a diversified organisation means that individual performances are often masked, either accidentally or intentionally. So an organisation, for example, that's highly diversified into, say, 10 different unrelated industries will probably tend to focus on its overall performance and say overall performance is great, 10% return on assets, we're doing really well. But then if you look at the individual business units, one business unit will be performing really well, the next will be performing very badly and so forth. Is the motivation for improving the poor performing business units as strong when the organisation is overall performing well? The answer is no. So by either manipulation such as transferring revenue and funding around in the organisation, and we've heard a bit of that about at the moment with the tax office saying that they're going to try to clamp down more on multinational organisations that manipulate their apparent performance by making internal income transfers. So, for example, the Australian division may be performing particularly well, and so they will internally borrow money from the perhaps another division that's in a low tax environment, say China or the Middle East, where there's no tax in many countries in the Emirates, for example. They'll borrow money, which they may or may not actually need, from those other divisions, pay a very high interest rate, maybe 20%, and effectively reduce their apparent profitability and use this mechanism to transfer their profitability to a different division where there is no tax, and then that division shows a huge profit because they're getting this high level of interest for the internal loan, and the tax exposure of the Australian division is reduced because they're claimed performance. So organisations are doing this sort of thing all the time, shifting resources and income and revenue around, and so there's a fair bit of this manipulation either to avoid tax and other factors, or simply to deal with internal demands. Look, we need some more capability here. We can't borrow it, we can't employ it locally, so we're just going to borrow it within the organisation, but we're probably not really going to reflect the cost of that. Because they're just going to keep their job in, say, Germany, and they're going to help out the people in, say, New Zealand. And really, if we should transfer the cost of that to the New Zealand operations, but we're just not going to do it because it's only for 6 months or it's only for 12 months. So we're going to skew the actual performance because we're going to give New Zealand a bit of a free ride, and we're going to burden Germany with the cost of people who aren't actually contributing because that's the most convenient way. But nevertheless, we have obscured the actual performance outcomes as a result of making those sorts of changes. So organisations either, for the best of reasons, or at least internally, from an internal perspective. Perhaps tax avoidance isn't a good reason, but for what are legitimate internal reasons, we'll move things around, and that will obscure performance, or they will just intentionally do that. Look, we don't really want the shareholders to know that we're not doing so well, so what we're going to do is we'll just transfer a few of our costs. We'll report in different ways and manipulate the outcomes. But that, of course, then completely obliterates the motivation for performance improvement. So everyone's busily managing perceptions and expectations of performance rather than a bold and clear statement. And in many cases, this is very understandable, apart from the performance, from the pragmatic aspects of, well, you know, we're going to have a bad patch, so if another business unit is going to help us out, we're not going to then say, look, we performed very badly, because the problem with that is that is an just simply reporting that is oversimplification. It also creates a whole perception of problems where they perhaps won't actually lie. So in many cases, organisations will try to manage the perceptions to provide a better measure of reality, because of course the performance metrics that they've got are crude, are simple, they're historical. Yeah, so if we, for example, we report on our performance in the last year, that's not really a great indicator, because we're doing really well this year, but we haven't got the records to report that yet. We have to report last year. So how do I do this? Do I show a really poor performance last year, which will put question marks over a business unit that's actually performing really well now, or do I try to manage the perception of how the business unit's performing? So the reality is, of course, they manage the perception because they think that's the right thing to do. So historical performance measures create a whole lot of challenges, and organisations respond in reality because of their own vested interests. Managers respond in particular ways because of their own vested interests differently, and so the performance metrics are at best not a great representation of performance. Nevertheless, we of course are looking at gaps between the desired performance and what we actually achieve. And so there's an example of how that might work in practice. So let's get down to SAFE. So it's got three components. The E just means evaluation, suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. And we're going to have a bit of a look at these dimensions. So suitability is all about how we respond to the opportunities and threats. Is it going to actually make sure everything's okay, or is it going to expose the organisation to problems? It might be a very exciting and an opportunistic strategy, but is it going to undermine our fundamental profitability, destroy our fundamental markets, or have some other serious negative impact which we can't afford to have? So risk management is a key component of suitability, and particularly acceptability, which I'll come on to in a minute. So organisations take risks every day. An organisation that is not taking risks will underperform. So this is not about not having risks, it's about managing risks. So there's two sets of criteria that are normally applied to risks, which we'll talk about in a minute, but just as a preview. One is the idea that you shouldn't take a risk that the organisation can't afford. So if the organisation puts all of its money, all its resources into a particular market that's unlikely to develop, but would be great if it did, that's a risk the organisation can't afford, because it's likely to fail, and that's likely to put the organisation out of business. However, making a small investment in an opportunistic strategy which could provide a great benefit as part of a larger portfolio of investments is something that organisations should do, because then they're playing the risks, they're playing the market, and one of the various things will probably work, and they probably will do very well from that. So managed risk is an important part of the assessment of strategies, but not excessive risk. And so when we look at managed risk, we have to consider the return relative to the risk. So a low level of risk with a low return is fine, but why are you bothering to deal with that? A high level of risk with a high return is potentially attractive if you can afford to do it. And so the organisation needs to look at the relative return versus the relative risk to decide. So some organisations are very conservative. So for example, maybe take the Australian Broadcasting Commission to have some parallels with the case today. They're a conservative organisation, they're government funded. So for them, they are down the lower end of the risk-return spectrum where they will take moderate risks and accept moderate returns. Whereas a high entrepreneurial organisation like Virgin that we were talking about last time will have in the portfolio, not all, but some very high risk, very, very high return or potential return activities and hope that at least one of those will actually provide the return. And that provides the future for the organisation. So that brings us down to acceptability down here. Ooh, I can't do that, can you? Does it meet the expectation of stakeholders? So if it's a strategy that sort of works quite well, but it's really very foreign to the people in the organisation, to the customers, to the suppliers, to the owners, then there's a real problem there, because although you may argue this is going to work really well, if nobody really understands it, nobody likes it, it's who's associated with the organisation, it's something that's very unusual and they're not comfortable with it, then it's not going to be well implemented. It's going to be too different, too foreign, too unknown. And so, for example, a CEO coming in from a different organisation might say, what we're going to do is we're doing a complete turnaround, we're going to change the way we do business, we're going to change the way we employ people. We used to have everyone on permanent employment, now we're going to have everyone on contract, we're going to do this. We're going to forget that market. We're dealing with we're trying to compete in the 10 to 15-year-old market. What we need to do is focus on the over 60-year-old market because that's where all the growth is. Look, we're going to also have to internationalise. And although all the argument behind all of these might be quite sound, this comes as such a shock. What, we're going to have offshore operations? What, we're going to just dump our traditional markets? It's too different, and the likelihood of it being accepted by the owners, the stakeholders, the shareholders, the staff, the customers, the suppliers will be too low, and it won't be successful. So then I've already talked about risk. Is the level of risk acceptable? Is the likelihood of return acceptable, as we've discussed? Or indicated, will the stakeholder reactions be positive? If they're not positive, then it's unlikely to be successfully implemented. Then we've got just the pragmatics, the feasibility. Will it actually work in practice? It's a great idea, but can it actually be implemented in this organisation? Let's think about the nuts and bolts, the details, the day-to-day implementation of this over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years that it takes to put this in place. Is that going to work? Do we really have enough resources? Strategies and the changes associated with them are almost inevitably grossly underestimated. So this is going to only cost the organisation $1 million to implement, but it doesn't. It costs 10 million or 100 million in practice. So does the organisation have the resources to finance it? Are the people really capable of doing that? On the surface, you might say, yeah, look, it's not very hard. All we're just doing is extending the market. You know, we used to deal with people who were 40 to 50. Now we're also going to have a separate market for people immediately post-retirement in their early 60s. Shouldn't be too difficult there. But reality is an entirely different set of skills is required for dealing with someone who's just retired versus someone who's in the workforce. The people in the workforce have got access to all sorts of forms of organisational support, so they've got one set of needs, but the retirees have got lots of time, they don't have resources, so they've got a very different set of needs. So the ability of your staff to deal with this second group, for example in a bank, might be much lower than you actually expected when you start to look at the details and the practicality of it. So do the skills really exist as opposed to looking like they ought to be available on the surface when you first think of the strategy? And other things that you require. You're assuming that you'll be able to access the knowledge. You'll assume that if you're now dealing with post-retirees, that you can set up a membership system that'll work quite well for your 500,000 members. And then when you get into practice, you discover that membership systems dealing with those sorts of numbers of people still don't exist. You're shocked to discover this. You think, well, that's not that hard. What does everyone else do? And then you find that everyone struggles with a membership system for numbers over 100,000, that there really aren't any good systems available for those. And so your assumption that, yeah, you can get that resource is wrong. So again, so that's an aspect of the feasibility. Can we really do what we think is reasonable, but we don't know about it because this is new. We're close to that place, so we've got a pretty good idea, but we haven't actually tested that out. So let's start to stress test this strategy and see if we can actually do all the things that we need to, we believe we need to. So let's look at suitability in a little more detail. So it's got to be leading the organisation in a positive direction rather than a wild direction. It's really got to be based on the argument that this is going to provide a net benefit and it's not going to create any major harm. It's got to make good use of the strengths. It's a great strategy. Look, this is massive opportunity and for us to sell our products in China. The market's huge. It's going to give us more revenue, so we're going to be better protected. It's a real global environment these days, so it's really going to make us a global organisation. Great. Opportunities and threats, no problems. But we have no strengths that are transferable to China, so we'd be starting from ground zero. So although the organisation has all of these capabilities, this new strategy is based on something that doesn't allow us to transfer any of those. So in terms of making good use of the resources of the organisation, that move to China wouldn't be any good because it doesn't take advantage of the opportunities. Or there might be the intermediate situation, which is even more tricky, where the organisation might say, now we're going to perform in China using social media, and we're really good at social media. We're really good at Western social media, so that's going to be a key strength. But when you look at the Chinese market, all the media is different. The approach that's taken is different. So an organisation that's really good in social media in Western countries would find that it has absolutely zero skills for social media in China. It's back at ground zero, or even worse, because it's got existing systems that will keep thinking that they will apply in China. So in this instance, again, the organisation is just starting with a blank page, and so it would have to be an extremely attractive and relatively simple opportunity for an organisation to choose to take it up when it can't transfer its key resources. So it's all about prioritising, because most organisations will have more opportunities available to them than they can implement. So we need to consider the suitability criteria as a filtering mechanism to get down to those couple of opportunities that pass strongly on the suitability criteria, rather than putting things through because they look attractive even though they're not as suitable. So we can use ranking, we can work out the relative competitive advantage, we can start to lay it out using decision trees and say, okay, what happens if we find this? And we've got two paths. What happens if we follow one of those paths? Then what happens if we encounter this situation? For example, a new competitor enters. What do we do then? And so look at the various options and start to unpack what would happen in practice. Okay, so therefore we make a decision about the suitability. So we've got there are a few illustrations. We'll look at a couple of them, but I'm just making reference to the text there. If it's ranking, illustration 2 in the text, decision trees, illustration 3, and life cycle analysis, illustration 4 there are a good example. So I want you to look at those in a little bit more detail. We can also use the VRIO criteria for assessing the basis of gaining a competitive advantage from our strategy. So if we look at, for example, is it rare? Is what we have going to be rare in that market? Are we going to create a significant advantage? Can our competitors there imitate it? Do we have the operational capabilities, if we come back to the example of internationalising to China, do we have the operational capacity to manage an international division? And of course, are we generating value, which is the basic opportunity criteria. So, looking at a decision tree, it's a little bit of an example here. We might have our current business and we decide our strategy is we're going to become larger because, why? Not just because we want to become larger, but because we want to increase our economies of scale, which will make us more profitable, give us more flexibility in terms of our pricing, and make us more competitive. for the future. So we've decided to go for growth. So if we do that, then we can do it two ways. We can push it hard and grow fast, or we can be very cautious and conservative. So if we decide that we're going to invest substantially in our growth, because if you're going to grow, you may as well grow fast, right? So then we've got the next question. Well, how are we going to grow fast? If we try and build our business units organically and develop them, then that's not fast. We won't be able to make a high level investment because there won't be anything to spend the money on. So better to, if we're going to go for high growth, fast growth, is to diversify. So the answer is yes, we'll diversify. So then you might go into this, and so we're currently conveying, and here is the example here in the text, of going into different sets, into areas of law by acquiring particular law firms. Or you might say, yep, growth, high investment growth, but diversification's too far. We're not any good. We've just at diversifying, we only know how to run one single business unit organisation. Running multiple divisions is a challenge that we're not ready for, so we draw the line at diversifying. So the answer is no. So what can we do? Oh, let's just expand geographically instead. That'll do. So we're currently located in Victoria only. We'll move to New South Wales, and we can double our market by moving to New South Wales. That's, you know, you can travel up and down. It's only an hour away. We can move some of our key staff there. They'll move to Sydney for a while we're setting up. That's a possibility for us without stressing the organisation too much around diversifying. And so you can use a decision tree to try and say, okay, how far do we go along these different option paths that we have? So we can also use some environmental testing to assess the suitability. We can do a Pestel analysis and say, okay, if we're going to diversify, if we're going to expand, if we're going to move into cost-based competition, what's the environment going to look like? So you can do a Pestel analysis. We can also do a scenario analysis, because Pestel, of course, is slightly historical. It looks at the information you had which applied to what has recently happened, whereas a scenario analysis tends to look in the future. So if we were to diversify, what would our customers do? What would our existing competitors do? What would we change the nature of that business? So if the organisation decided it was going to geographically, it was going to internationalise, and it was a big company, and they were going to internationalise into perhaps a small developing country, they might say, actually, our presence there will have a significant effect on the economics of the whole country. What's likely to happen? Are we going to create an environment that's attractive in that country, or is our physical presence actually going to make it less attractive for us? So scenario planning will enable you to follow that process through and work out what might happen. Fire forces analysis, similar thing, but obviously more in terms of what will happen in the organisation's industry. And finally, strategic groups are also useful. You can consider the fact that, well, perhaps our strategy should move us from one strategic group, where we're currently located, which does okay, but the overall size of that group is not very big, so it suggests the market's not great, to another strategic group. That would be a good strategy, because that would take us to an area where a lot of organisations seem to be doing quite well. So, implementing a strategy has change associated with that. We've discussed that already. It's rarely just adding. Why? Because organisations have limited resources. So if they are going to do something new, they usually have to stop doing something else in order to be able to do the new thing. You usually can't just simply add it. You can go out and borrow some money, and you can acquire some new resources. That's one thing you can do. On the other hand, you also then increase the debt burden, which means that you then stop making as much revenue or as much profit. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because you need your existing people to do other things. Yes, you can employ more staff, but you can't just simply employ the total number of staff that you require for the new activity, because then they're completely divorced from the rest of the organisation. So you rely on your existing processes and your existing staff and your existing capabilities to be transferred over. So it means if you're going to do something new with those people, then they've got to stop doing something else that they used to do. So there is always some degree of retrenchment associated with any strategic change. So you're going to withdraw from some area where you can afford to withdraw, and it's usually where the opportunities are low. So if it was a particular market that was declining, you might start to pull your resources out of that market because you're going to give up on that in favour of the new opportunity. So that's a good use of strengths, and that's requires you to really know what your key strengths are and say, okay, look, this market's not going anywhere. We're going to let ourselves slide out of that market, and we're going to move our staff who are supporting that market currently, trying to hold it up, into the new area. Market penetration, obviously, if that's the case, then you're looking at gain of market share. For Advantage, I can't underestimate that, emphasise that enough, or overemphasise that enough. Growth, I always hear people say, we're going to go for growth, and that's it, full stop. And that's actually just a really bad idea, because that's a change for no particularly good reason. Growth is only sensible when there is some advantage to be gained from that. For example, if the organisation is already very large and it decides to grow larger, then it might experience diseconomies of scale, as we have talked about before, and actually become less efficient because it becomes too large. So growth is not automatically a benefit. Why growth is viewed positively is that it usually, for smaller organisations that are not too massive, it usually leads to greater economies of scale. It usually leads to greater market breadth, which provides a degree of, reduces the degree of risk associated on focusing on a smaller market segment. So growth generally has some positives with it, but they're not absolutely guaranteed. They're not automatically going to come from growth. So growth always has to be qualified as providing something that the organisation needs. And just saying generating more revenue is not enough. It's got to actually create a genuine competitive advantage. That's the motivation for growth. The expense associated with growth and the risk of harming the organisation is far too great for it to be just thrown in there. So I just mention that because that's something I regularly see, and it really doesn't make sense when you think about it at all. Okay, new products and services, exploit existing knowledge, market development. Then if your current markets are saturated, there's no more growth there, then you look at geographical spread and you use what you've currently got and you give it to other people. Diversification, again, if there's nowhere to go in your existing environment, your competition is high, the future's not great, then you move outside the core business and exploit, again, your capabilities to be able to do new things. So those are some of the criteria that you would normally see, and that they have a logic to them. Organic diversification, you can't simply plan by purchasing or forming partnerships. So instead you decide to use your own capabilities and just become more capable and allow that to expand your market. So I remember many years ago visiting a small aircraft manufacturing facility, and I thought the history was rather intriguing. They'd started out in the 1920s as a car repair, just a garage where you took your car to be repaired. And then someone who owned a light aircraft had asked them to come out because that aircraft was having problems and saying, well, it's got an engine in it, you deal with engines, can you come look at the engine in the aircraft? So they said, okay, we'll go out and do that. And so they did that, and then as a result of that, they started to get a little bit of a name for being able to do basic maintenance on aircraft, and there was a limited amount of aircraft maintenance available at the time. So then this side of the business started to grow, so of course then they became more capable with the specifics of aircraft maintenance. And they just allowed that to keep going, and the demand for aircraft maintenance from them continued to grow, and their interest in car maintenance, vehicle maintenance, sort of stayed the same or dropped away. And then, for no particularly good reason, they found themselves transforming from your average garage in the street where you take to have your car serviced to an aircraft manufacturer. So it obviously took many years, but this was a great example of organic growth, where they moved from cars to aircraft, which is a pretty big step. But apart from the fact that there was a decision to continue to dabble in the aircraft area. That was all they did, and they just allowed this organic growth just to move them into that area. Organic diversification can work quite effectively. They just slowly built the capabilities which made them more attractive, which gave them more business, which enabled them to build more capacity, which made them even more attractive, and so that particular one followed that path. I think it was also to do with the physical location, that aircraft aren't that easy to move around. Obviously they can fly, but you need another airport to fly to. And if, for example, you've got a problem and your aircraft shouldn't leave the ground, then it's stuck where it is, so that the service needs to come to the aircraft. So I think it was part of their success was just the fact that they were the only people providing the service in that particular location. So mergers and acquisitions are fast, and they bring new capabilities in, and they bring obviously new challenges due to mismatches of cultures. Alliances are a little less of a commitment. They're an agreed partnership. Yes, resources will be committed, but not the same as the money required to acquire a business unit. So they offer speed and capability development, and also a bit more diversity, which are generally good things. So theoretically, everyone should just really focus on alliances and partnerships rather than mergers. But frequently, of course, organisations make an acquisition rather than an alliance. Would anyone like to suggest why? More control, yes. Who said that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, more control. The problem is with partners, you've got equal or maybe imbalanced equity, but you've got shared equity. And so they'll have different ways of doing things. So who's in charge? And even if one organisation says, well, look, we're 70%, you're 30% in this partnership deal, we're in charge, it doesn't mean that the other partner is therefore going to do things the way that the majority partner wants it to be done. The only way you can have the control to say, this is the way it will be done because this is consistent with everything else we do, is to own that organisation. So you would have found that with the group assignment. You can have someone in charge who generally leads the project, but they're not actually going to be able to force every individual to behave exactly as you'd like to do. Some people won't do their work in time. Some will do something different to what they're asked for. Why? Because they're individuals and the level of control is low. So with investment, what you spend, your level of control increases. So if you've got two equal partners and neither put any money in, then they both have equal control. If one organisation says, we're going to invest $1 billion in here, and the other organisation says, we'll put $500 million in here, the one that puts $1 billion in will have more control. And if you follow that continuum, the organisation that purchases the other organisation has the maximum control. So control is a key thing. It's a higher risk, but sometimes organisations say, we can't do this without a high degree of control. It's just not going to work, and the only way to get the control is to acquire. Okay, let's get on to acceptability now. Have risk and return, which are very highly related, and then we have the reactions of those who need to be on board, which are customers, suppliers, people in the organisation, and the community. So risk, as I've indicated, is about management. There's going to be an acceptable level of risk depending upon the nature of the organisation. Is it conservative? Is it risk-taking? Is it ambitious? Is it a slow-grow organisation? So there's going to be an overarching perspective of what is acceptable, and that's more of the stakeholder view. The more clinical aspect of it is, as I said, the risk versus the return and the safety factor. If the organisation is not exposed to permanent harm as a result of the risk, then the issue is simply, okay, what's the return relative to the risk? And if it's a high risk, then we're really expecting to see a high return, because why would you take a high risk for a low potential return? No point in doing that. If you're lucky enough to get a high likelihood of return and a high likelihood of, high likelihood of return but a low risk, that's fantastic. but that probably means you've misjudged the situation. Because why? Because everyone's competing for opportunities. And there's an opportunity out there for that gives a great return but low risk. You can be assured that everyone will be wanting to have it. So if you just say, oh, we just found this great opportunity, no one else knows about it. That just can't be true. That cannot be true in the case of organisations in particular. So it's extremely rare to find low risk, high return. So you're either looking at low risk, low return, or high risk, high return, and you want to make sure that they're actually there, and make your assessment as to of all the risk return options that you're given, which one provides the best risk relative to return and is within your comfort zone. Okay, so formal risk assessments are normally used: exposure, social exposure, competitive exposure, financial exposure relative to the returns in each of those areas. It's really important to do sensitivity analysis and work out what the real situation is, because most organisations will evaluate an opportunity on the basis of the most positive assessment or outcome expectations possible. They will very rarely say, look, there's a relatively high risk, but the return is actually pretty ordinary. It could be good, but it might just be mediocre. It's going to be between good and mediocre, but it's high risk, so let's do it. They won't say that. They'll say, it's high risk, but the return is really high. There's a tendency when you're looking at these things to choose the most positive outcomes or the least threatening context and say, look, it's a bit high risk, we don't know what's going to happen in the market, but there's no one else there, so we'll just go in, and if it works, then we get the whole market, right? Well, what happens if your competitors are doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time? And you go in and, oh, there's someone else in there arriving at exactly the same time. But in the decision-making process, that will tend to be ignored. Sensitivity analysis says, okay, great, but what happens if someone else decides to enter this new market at the same time and we get half of it? Is this going to be good enough for us? Or is it really small and we needed the whole thing? So sensitivity analysis looks at how the performance drops away. And often, in many cases, the argument is only valid on the basis of the most optimistic outcomes. If you just step away from the optimistic outcomes, well, costs were 10 to 20% higher than we thought. We didn't get the market share. We only got half the market share we thought. As soon as you start to look at those opportunities, you'll find that many, or those outcomes, you'll find that many opportunities that appeared positive stop being positive. They're probably constructed of a high cost and a high benefit. And the positive outcome says that the benefit is a little bit higher than the cost, so let's do that. But the sensitivity analysis says, actually, small variation, it can look like that very easily, in which case it's going to cost us more than we're going to get out of this. So then it doesn't look nearly as attractive. The gap needs to be like that, so that even if the cost is a bit higher and the benefit is a bit lower, then there's still a positive outcome. But many organisations will look at this situation and say, look, we can make 10% if everything goes perfectly. And if it doesn't, we'll lose 10%. So sensitivity analysis is all about what are reasonable levels of variation. And so you've got this, this little graph here that shows, the cases based on the annual cash flow. Yeah, we can afford to do this. This is what our cash flows are looking like. So we can afford to do this market expansion. However, if there is a slight increase in competition or a slight downturn in the economy, then we'll find our annual cash flow will diminish accordingly, and suddenly we can't afford to do it anymore. We went from being able to pay for this out of cash revenue to having to borrow money. That's an entirely different situation, and so the proposition only works if we need, say, 1.5, and this is pounds for no particular good reason, 1.5 million pounds. It only works if cash flow stays at the most optimal level. If our cash flow realistically is affected by a 2 or 3% drop, then suddenly, in some factor, then suddenly we don't have that 1.5 million pounds, and it's not going to work.
because then we're going to go and borrow the money. So that's a completely different ballgame. So that's an example of sensitivity analysis. I think it's really important. It's rarely used. Why? Because everyone wants to be positive. Let's not worry people with the negatives. Let's focus on the positives here. Okay, this is going to work. I'm really sure it's going to work. This is the normal language you hear spoken, and there's a degree of sensibleness behind it, but I also think that there's also, in many cases, if you're talking about spending $1 billion, there's also a degree of irrationality around that. That sort of investment, that sort of impact, people losing their jobs, those sorts of things, really requires the organisation to be careful about the likely outcomes. But mostly they're not. So what are our return measures? We've got financial analysis, we've got shareholder value. There's some formula for shareholder value there, which you can use. The cost-benefit analysis, which we've talked about, and also considering the various options, and they're really clearly explained in the text, so you can have a look at those in a little bit more detail. But let's just have a quick visit to some of these. Okay. So if we look at our return on capital or our payback period, then we can see, if we're going to get this sort of situation where it's a positive growth, that's great. It's going to cost us a little bit in the first year and a half to 2 years, but after that we're actually making a good return from this. So can we justify that? Yes, we can. We can pay for that out of cash, so we can tolerate the poor return. If that curve never got above 5%, what will we say about this project? If the return on capital employed would never got above 5%, that line was much more horizontal, what would we have to say about this? It's a low rate of return, right? Okay, and that's the sort of money that you can get from the bank, which is 100% safe. You can just take your $1 billion and you can put it in the bank and say, I've got $1 billion to invest, and they'll say, all right, you can have 5% return on that, and it starts tomorrow, and there's no risk. So it's got to show a return for a commercial enterprise that is above, is above a reasonable performance level. But what about for a non-commercial enterprise? We still have to consider the return, because non-commercial enterprises spend money the same way as a commercial enterprise does. It's just that they don't show a profit. They still employ staff, they still pay the light bills, they still build buildings, they still train people, they do all the same things that a commercial enterprise does. So they're still spending money the same way. So does this apply therefore to a non-commercial enterprise, to an NGO or a government department? Or can a government department say, look, it's not going to, it's going to cost us more. We can do this thing, but we're never going to get any financial return from that. Maybe a couple of percent only, but we're going to do it because we think it's good. Is that okay? It's still not okay, because it still damages the financial capability of the organisation to continue to operate. The organisation still needs to be able to direct its revenue in a profitable way. It still needs a little bit of cash to spend on things. It still needs to make good use of its money. So even a government department doesn't have the luxury of saying, we're doing this only because we think it's a good thing. Sometimes it can afford to do that. That's a bit of like a loss leader, or it's using the BCG diagram, it's a bit of a star. We're going to do that because even though we're probably going to lose money on it, even though it's probably going to be a bit of a cost burden, it's something that we need to do for the future, it's something that we need to do for the community, it's something that we need to do because that's what our organisation is about, and we can't be cost neutral or positive about everything. We've got to accept some things that are done at cost. That's fine as well, to the point, up and to the point where it then starts to compromise the financial future of the organisation, and that's where the line is drawn. So yes, even for a non-commercial enterprise, then the return on this is warranted. So let's take an extremely mundane example. A local municipal council says, We've got a bit of a problem. Our community, because it's very dense, very densely occupied, we have a lot of backup of rubbish, and that's resulted in a lot of rodents and pests in the area. It's also created some health problems, which have been some associated health costs. So we're proposing to go to, this is a very mundane example, rubbish pickup twice a week. Now, the organisation needs to say, okay, so that means that we've got to employ more contractors or more staff, we're going to get more machines, we've got to do something during the week, there's going to be interruption to traffic at that time, so it's going to have some impact. So there's two criteria, isn't there? You can just say, well, okay, well look, we just have to do this because it's a good thing, right? Because maybe people's health is at risk because there's too much rubbish lying around. We need to collect it twice a week if we're going to keep our municipality clean enough. So we've got to just do it, right? There's still the imperative saying, well, fine, but if it makes the municipality bankrupt, you can't afford it, then no, you can't do it. So there needs to be an assessment of the relative benefit of that. And you might say, well, look, this is going to cost half of our total revenue. Are you sure the benefit is warranted? And yes, you can put the benefit in financial terms. You could say this is the reduction in pest keeping costs, this is the reduction in health associated costs. Or you could compare it to other returns. You could say that currently we're getting, in the community, we've got 100 cases of health issues that have been attributed to environmental factors. So if we implement this, how much is it likely to reduce these health issues? Is it warranted on that basis? So the point of all of this is that the return versus the expense always needs to be considered. It doesn't matter whether you're deciding whether or not you're going to do twice weekly rubbish pickups instead of once a week, or whether you're deciding whether you're going to build a new factory to increase the volume or reduce your operating costs. So typically we'll see a net cash flow like this, where there's an outgoings in the first few years while you're trying to, which exceed the income because you're trying to build up a new sales and you're trying to get it right, and of course you had to invest a lot to put it in place in the first case. And then after time we start making a profit because the factory's in place, it's working well, the market's there, we're making good sales, and so we compensate for the negative cash flow. So in this instance, you can see that the payback period is 3.5 years. Why? Because there was 10 million spent in the first year, lost in the first year. Then from a cash flow perspective, we made 2 million the second year, so that, and so obviously it takes 3.5 years before the income and the profit balances out the outcome. Now the issue is that means that you're back in 3.5 years to where you were from a cash perspective before you started. What's the issue associated with that? That's fine, isn't it? 3.5 years, then you just make some profit. That's good. What if this was a car? You introduce a new model of a car, it costs you £10 million or $10 million to introduce the new model of a car. It's actually more like about 100 million, but so it costs you about $10 million to introduce a new model of a car. All the equipment, the design, everything like that. Sales in the first year are flat because it's a new model, then they start to pick up. So it takes you 3.5 years to get your payback from the new model of the car. What's the problem with that? It's about time to think about a new model after 3.5 years. That's pretty much the lifespan, 3.5, maybe 5 years. So you don't have much opportunity to actually generate a return from that. You spend most of the time just paying back what you spent to get it in place. So extended payback periods are high risk because it may be either as a result of market demands or in unavoidable things such as the product life cycle that you can't get a good return from that. So if it was software, for example, and it took 3.5 years to pay for it, what's the issue there? There's no way you're going to ever make a profit from that because 3.5 years absolutely exceeds the product life cycle of most software. So, the payback period is critical. How quickly does it take you to get your money back? Will you be able to still make some money at the end of the day? Or will you be able to have some positive outcome? Okay, shareholder value. There's a number of ways of calculating that, either the economic value added or the shareholder return or the shareholder value created. There's slight differences in each of the approaches. The shareholder value created is generally considered to be the most suitable. We've got some information here. This is our share price. Then we've got some dividends. The share price goes up, and so the total share price benefit is expressed as 25%. So that's an easy one, just based on shareholder return. If we look at economic value added, that's a little bit more complicated because that's to do with the actual revenues. So we've got our profit here. Just lost the mouse. 10 million. We had to put 100 million of capital into that, so the cost of capital is currently running at 8%. That's the interest rates. Then, as a result of that, we have a interest cost of $8 million per year, and that leads to an economic value added of 10 million minus the 8 million interest, which means that we are now running it at a profit of $2 million. So, the economic value added for the stakeholder is 2 million per year. So you then need to judge that against the risk associated with the project. Okay, finally we get on to acceptability. You've decided that it's practical, that you can do it, it makes good, it doesn't introduce harm to the organisation, it makes good use of the internal resources, it's going to provide a good return, it's not going to take too long to provide the return. All of the indicators to date are positive. Now we have to decide whether it's just a crazy idea that no one wants to do, or it's an idea that's going to be taken up. So an example of an idea that will generally be accepted is geographical diversification. We've done so well in Victoria, we're going to expand to New South Wales. Sounds good, great. Okay, good market there. Everyone's going to be pretty positive about that. We're having some trouble with the future, or concerns about the future prosperity of what we do, so we're going to transform the organisation. We're going to sell all our assets, we're going to invest in the stock market, and then we're going to put our money into some future endeavour. All the stakeholders are going to say, that's a crazy idea. Why are you walking away from everything that you've built over this time? So, even if these two options meet all the other criteria, we still have to determine whether the stakeholders are going to allow you to do it, whether they're going to be part of it or whether they're going to block it every step of the way. And if there is internal organisational resistance, if there is community resistance, customer resistance, supplier resistance, the impact of these will almost definitely destroy the benefit of the strategy. So it's important to consider the political context and agenda and the likely reaction of stakeholders. Why have I introduced the idea of politics? What's that got to do with this? What has company and stakeholder and supply chain politics got to do with this? Anyone? What has politics got to do with this? Well, the politics is the primary mechanism for both resistance and support for projects. Given that a strategy project is a new thing for the organisation, it doesn't have much to do with the way things are normally done on a day-to-day basis. It's an extra imposition on the top of the organisation. We're now going to do this. We're now going to open up this new market. We're going to acquire a new business unit. It's just a new thing. It's not part of the day-to-day management operations. Eventually, the consequences will be absorbed in, but for the first year or 2 years or 3 years, it's just simply an imposition on the top. So people have to buy into it. And how do people buy into things? They buy in through politics. They buy in by following those influential people. They buy in by the influential people in the organisation providing support. The politics are often the mechanism through which most of the communication occurs. You think about public politics. If there is an event that needs to be considered, what is the first thing that happens? There's all this dialogue. It's on the radio. People get up and make announcements. People offer their own view. Consultants, experts are consulted. Everyone's having a conversation. But the conversation doesn't occur until it becomes politically active. If it's just on a piece of paper, that conversation will never occur. So we need politics to actually generate the interest in the project and then not to become a barrier. So we want a degree of political activity. Otherwise, it's just going to stay on a piece of paper and no one's going to pay any attention. So we can write our strategy and we can say, here's our strategy, Mimo. Please diversify. Here's some directions as to how to diversify. Good luck with it. Thanks a lot. Let us know how it goes, how it's going. Yours sincerely, the board. Put that out in the newsletter. Everyone will ignore it. Nothing will happen. There will be no strategy implementation because everyone's busy with their day-to-day business. There's been no political engagement with it, so no one will consider it to be legitimate. No one will take any action. No one will consider the factors. It will just get left alone. So what we need then is for people to say, oh gosh, this is pretty serious. How are we going to do this? Start the debate, start the activity, start the conversations, get it to people's attention, start to make it a topic of conversation. Have you seen the new strategy? How do you think we're going to do that? I don't know. I think it's a good strategy myself because, I'm a bit concerned about our market decline. Yeah, but, think about all the money we've got to spend. And these conversations need to occur at the individual level. And this is when the political activity occurs. Now, if the political activity blows out and becomes very large, then everything stops because everyone becomes engaged in the conversation. People who oppose it start to build up their ability and to do that using their internal sources of power, such as control over key resources or information or their ability to influence others. And the barriers start to grow. And the project starts to slow down, possibly stalling altogether. So if there's too much political engagement, then it destroys the outcome. If there's too little political engagement, then no one notices it and it still doesn't happen. So you need a degree of political engagement to bring it to the surface, to make it a conversation and to therefore encourage people to take action in relation to that. Because it's extremely difficult. How does the board actually go around and make sure everyone's doing the strategy? Right, so they can bring in the senior managers and say, make sure everyone's doing this strategy. And the senior managers say, right, okay. And then they will speak to their area managers and say, make sure everyone's doing the strategy. Can you give us some documents? And then there'll be documents floating around and there'll be a bit of activity, but it won't be enough to actually push the organisation forwards. Not if there is no political engagement. But if there is political engagement, this provides all of the informal infrastructure, all the informal networking, all the informal conversation, planning and communication that's really necessary for the strategy. And as I said, because a strategy is not a part of normal day-to-day business, there is no mechanism in place to make it happen otherwise. You just don't have it. You don't have the, okay, now it's Tuesday morning, I've got to produce this report, my weekly report. Tuesday afternoon, we've got the staff meeting, then I've got this, then I've got to do that, then I have to do a quick tour around the factory. I've got all these activities. So that's how everything works on a normal day-to-day basis. But the strategy's got nothing to do with that. And more importantly, that person's day is full. They don't have room for the strategy. It's got to force its way in and say, okay, we're going to cut the staff meeting because I've got to do this, or we use the staff meeting normally to discuss opportunities for improvement, but today we're going to use it to discuss the new strategy. So it's got to force its way into the existing system, and the only way to do that is political engagement. So politics is critical, both the context and the agenda. If everyone is disengaged in the organisation, then a dramatic strategy is not going to work. So if the general political environment is, look, most people just stay in this organisation for 6 months and they move on, no one really likes it, it's boring, they don't like the customers, you're not going to get them to engage in any change. They've got no commitment. So that would be a political context which is very, makes any significant strategy implementation very difficult. Then there's the agenda. So we can't implement those sorts of changes because the union is very powerful in this organisation. Everyone's a union member. They're all a member of the same union. And if the union doesn't agree with the change you're going to make, then you can forget anyone else actually in the organisation doing that. So there may be political agendas. And then there's the reaction of the stakeholders as well. All right. Now, feasibility, can it work in practice? We've got two critical questions. Do we have enough resources and competencies to actually do this? Do we know how to do it? Coming back to the example of expanding to China, do we know how to do this? Are we able to access those resources? Or is this a bit of a wild, ambitious thing that we really don't know how to make it happen, and we've got no idea as to whether we've got the resources? We're in business, so we know how to develop markets. It's not like we're completely foreign to the idea, but we don't have any market-specific resources. So that's a problem. Can we get them? Yes, we can. All right, that's the solution. Can we get them? Maybe. Then that's a high risk. On the other hand, its expansion into New South Wales, that's fine. We can use our existing resources. We've got lots of customers in New South Wales. We just really haven't been servicing them properly. We've got quite a few networks. Yeah, there's nothing really there. It's just a conscious decision to do what we probably should have done a while ago. So yeah, we've got the resources and capabilities. That's going to be fine. So therefore, questions become financially, what's it going to cost to get those resources? People-wise, are they actually available? So, for example, the Australian wine industry, sort of 20 years ago, really, or even 30 years ago in the 1980s and 1990s, really became very consolidated and very effective. As a result of that, Australian wine exports increased dramatically year on year. The value of the exports increased particularly even more than the volume increased. So the price of Australian wines that were exported went up because people were prepared to pay for more, and the volume went up. So the industry said, wow, we're looking at a double challenge here in terms of resources. Not only are we trying to produce higher quality wines, but we're also trying to produce more of them year on year. There's not enough people in the industry, and so the whole industry banded together to establish their own research centre, to create their own courses with the universities in winemaking, to ensure that in the future there was enough winemakers in Australia to actually be able to support the industry. So for them, they might say, great, we've got all this market growth, we can get some winemakers, right? Winemakers, you can get them from anywhere. No, you couldn't. There was a shortage of winemakers, and so the industry had to, excuse the pun, had to grow its own winemakers in order to enable it to expand. So you might look at things and think, great, you know, we're going to get some more stuff, but then you might discover that they just don't exist. And you didn't really notice that because you weren't growing fast and the natural rate of appearance of these people was sufficient. But you didn't realise that in actual fact, all of the winemakers were already being soaked up by the industry and there was no spare capacity. So people and skills, are they really there, or is something fairly dramatic like I just described required to provide that? And how do you integrate them? If you're going to do something new, how do you get the business in New South Wales integrated with the rest of the business? How do you make sure that they don't go off on a tangent and start doing other things? Because hey, it's a new business and they're going to adapt to the local environment in a probably different way. But we don't want that because we want them to connect with what we're doing, so we build economies of scale. Half the reason for going into New South Wales was to build our existing economies of scale, not just to start up a separate business unit. If we're going to do that, we may as well just continue to supply New South Wales from Victoria. We're trying to do that to build our existing capabilities. But that's not going to make as much sense to the people in New South Wales because they're looking at a new and emergent market and they're going to want to do different things for that market to make their performance best. But that won't be to the net benefit of the organisation. Okay, so looking at the financial feasibility, obviously the funding requirements are highest in the earlier stages. The cost of capital is therefore the highest in the earlier stages, and therefore the risk is highest in the earlier stages. the risk also tends to grow again a bit later down the track, because in the early stages your guess about the market is probably fairly good, but 5, 6, 7 years down the track you're really not going to have any idea of what's going to happen then, and so you've made this investment, but in 7 years' time you really don't know whether you're still going to be making good use of that. So we're going to go all the way back to the example of the municipality that says, great, we've got we've set up to have 2 rubbish collections per week now. We've got the place clean. It's reduced health risks associated with that. It's been a good outcome. But what's going to happen in 7 years' time? We don't know what the community is going to be like. We don't know if we're going to have this same population density. We don't know if we're going to have a greater population density. We don't know if other factors have become implemented, in which case we don't know whether it will continue to have a significant impact on health in the community in 7 years' time. And it was a really big expense to achieve that. And so our risk of exposure of what we spent versus the return in the longer term tends to come up back into medium to high risk. Funding sources, the organisation can pay for itself out of cash flow, or it can bring in external debt providers. Banks are increasingly common sources of resources, except for the very largest organisations, which obviously have to go to the capital markets and to stock listings and IPOs to generate income, and there's various sources there. All right, people and skills, I think we've already talked about that. The more important ways to consider or ways to view your people capabilities are work organisation. Do you need to change the way things are done? If you internationalise a lot, if you extend to New South Wales a bit, do you run New South Wales, all the people in New South Wales, are they part of the existing departments you have in Victoria? Are they a part of a parallel department? Do you just have a department of New South Wales? How are you going to make it work? So you're going to have to change the work organisation to accommodate these new people. Rewards, what's the rewards for setting up the new business in New South Wales versus continuing the business in Victoria? In Victoria, it's probably about innovation and new product development. In New South Wales, it's probably all about project management, customer relationships and those sorts of things, because they're different environments. One's a mature market, one's a new and emerging market, so the rewards need to be different. The relationships are going to be different because of the difference in the markets. The training's going to be different as a result of that, and therefore recruitment and promotion in those two environments will be different. So typically what you get is, if you internationalise, the people from the organisation's head office or home country, some of those will usually go to the foreign environment. The people who do well in the foreign environment usually do poorly in the home environment. That is, that they're a bit entrepreneurial and they're a bit annoying in the home environment where everything's relatively static and predictable, but they're just the right sort of people to go out into the new subsidiary and push for growth and be entrepreneurial. So you're going to need to recruit and promote quite different people for your new activity than the people you traditionally had in your old activity. All right, so integrating the resources, I think that's fairly straightforward, people, information systems and so forth. So implementation, how does it all work? So we need strong leadership. People need to feel, and this comes back to the political aspect, that this is not just a memo that's been circulated with no commitment, that this is a serious decision the organisation's made. It's not going to change its mind in 6 months' time and back off on that. If people think, oh, I don't know, they're serious about this, this could just blow over in the next few months, who is going to make an investment in that? Right? Stopping what you normally do as a manager, for example, to invest in a strategy which might just disappear in 6 months means that your performance as a manager will have decreased, because you won't be able to say, oh, what we did was we spent more time and money on that strategy, you know, the one that we didn't implement, and as a result our baseline performance has decreased. That's not something that's going to work. So people need to know that this is a serious commitment, it's a long-term commitment, that the organisation is going to go down that path before they will make their own commitment. It has to be clear. There can be no doubt about what's involved. It can't be ambiguous. It's got to be clearly defined. There's got to be correct measures for performance. How do you measure the performance of a strategy implementation? Well, you need to set stepping stones, intermediate goals that you measure it by. So in the first 12 months, we should have achieved the following. In the next 12 months, then we should have achieved this, and it should have resulted in this much revenue, and given the cash flow, it's likely to result in this level of loss. So that there are criteria that you can track the implementation against. So that's a critical component of performance management of the strategy implementation, as opposed to the normal performance management of the organisation, which is about maintaining what it normally does. Resource allocation. If you're going to expand into New South Wales, how are you going to make sure that you really get the right people? So ambitiously you can say, oh, we've got some really good staff. If we get them to go to New South Wales, that'll be fine. But maybe they won't go. Oh, I can't go because my kids have just gone to school here. I'm not moving away. I can't go because I've got a sick relative. I can't go because I don't like New South Wales. And so the reality will be quite different to what the organisation hopes will be the case, because it doesn't normally test out the mobility and flexibility of its resources. Oh, we've got all these great design resources. Yeah, but they only know about the Victorian market. Oh, but we can use them in New South Wales. Actually, we can't use them in New South Wales because the regulations are so different in New South Wales. Most of our design processes don't apply there. Ah, so we don't really have the resources for design in New South Wales. No, actually, we haven't got them, even though you'd think we would by looking at them. So the reality of the resource allocation can be quite different to what it would appear on the surface. So we need to, we inevitably will be faced with conflicts. Well, this is fine, but you know, if we're going to have 3 years of negative profitability, then we've got a real problem with our shareholders. They're not going to be happy with that. We have a conflict around the long-term benefit of this versus the short-term investment expectations of the shareholders. So we have to work out how we're going to resolve that conflict. We have to make sure that each of the elements of the strategy is consistent with each other, so that we're not trying to do one thing in one area that requires a completely different set of resources to the other area. We try to move the whole thing as a package as much as possible so that we have the least disturbance on the organisation. The implementation will inevitably bring up problems, as we have been discussing. So a pilot study, a low-cost trial is a great way to stress test the idea. This worked really well, but guess what? We found when we did the pilot study, and we only moved 20 staff there, that was all the staff we were able to move. The initial idea of moving 100 staff, we can't do that. We'll never be able to do that. So just as well we did the pilot, because it worked really well, the big problem we have is we won't have enough staff. So we have to rethink the staff thing. So that was a good test. All right. So in summary, we've got economic and organisational effectiveness as our measures. A gap will create the basis for why we're doing it. We've got our safe criteria of suitability, acceptability and feasibility to judge whether we should really be taking that particular strategic approach. And I've just thrown in there for next week, the case we're going to be dealing with is called Alphabet, who drives the strategy. All right, that brings us to an end, and we're doing a little better for time than we have on other days. So let's take a break. Not many of us, 10 minutes is enough, I think. So let's come back we'll make it 11 minutes at 10 to 11, and then we'll have a look at the case for today. Start, and we'll start to have a look at the case. Look what it likes. We're down to the core team now. This is about ITV. Has anyone read the case? Can they tell me what ITV is? Yep, and they're relative to the BBC, which is number one. They are, and they're number two. So they're quite large, and they've got some platforms, and they've gone through a bit of an evolution, as the case describes, and it leaves them with a little bit of an uncertain future. Have they done well? Yeah, they have historically performed quite well. Key strengths, what were they? Content, yeah, and the production, the strength, the content is performance in actual fact. So they've been able to produce content which is attractive to the market, and the reason they've done that is that they own their own studios and recording resources which have enabled them to perform quite well, in addition to buying third-party content. Is this video bit working all right? Seems, oh, is that jumping around too wildly? Is it a bit disturbing? All right, I can change the mechanism that it uses. Yeah, that's quite disturbing, isn't it? Let me see, where is it? Cameras, which one is it? That one? Yes. Audio tracking. All right. I think I can leave it parked actually. That's about right where it is, isn't it? That'll do. Yep. All right. So I think that should just keep it parked there now. Is that the case? Yeah. It's not moving around, is it? No. All right. Good. So, yes. So we're just discussing the fact that that they've got some key resources which have enabled them to perform quite well, but guess what's happened? The world's moved on. They're a little bit worried. They're particularly worried about future changes. What's one of the biggest future changes that they're worried about? Who's their biggest competitor? BBC is, and coming close, Netflix as well. So basically they're worried that both parties are encroaching on their market. BBC was non-commercial, so that reduced their effectiveness. So that had an impact on them. And they're concerned that BBC is going to start to privatise and that they'll cut into their market in what they do traditionally. Netflix is growing, Amazon Movies is growing and cutting into the other side of what they had to offer. So they're concerned that their market share is going to be squeezed from two really strong competitors. Netflix being international, a multinational, very large-scale business, BBC being the industry leader. So they have good right to be concerned. All right, so suitability. What are they trying to do? What does the case say that they're trying to do? Anything? Okay. So they're going to increase their online activity. One of the things that they did was their original online server system player didn't work very well. It wasn't as good as the BBC's one. It wasn't as good as Netflix. They were pumping ads through it, and neither the BBC nor Netflix were, so they thought they'd go to a piece of software that worked better, and that they would make it a subscription basis so that you didn't, it looked more like the BBC and Netflix offer. The BBC's one was free, but you only got BBC content. The Netflix one you had to pay for, but you didn't get ads. So instead of trying to be somewhere in the middle where you got content without paying for it, but you had to watch ads, they decided to move over to the Netflix model of pay for it but get no ads. Okay, so more online activity. What else? Well, they're trying to, although it was a bit vague in the case, they were continuing to try to differentiate themselves further, weren't they, by what? Come on, you got half the word already. No one? Yes, very good. Good guess. Okay, why were they acquiring? What was the point of that? Why were they acquiring? Did they need more volume? What was the purpose of it? To have an even broader range of content. Okay, so they were trying to add more high quality content. They weren't trying to get their costs down. No mention in the case of really trying to get their costs down. They're all an income high quality producer, so they were worried about diversity and differentiation and measures of quality as perceived by the customer, which is how much they like the show. So what was their most successful product? They mentioned in the case. Okay, we don't have a lot of case knowledge here. It was Downton Abbey, which was a very successful TV show, and that was more successful than Doctor Who and, yes, Sherlock Holmes, which were the BBC competitive products. So, they were a high quality producer, and as I said, all the way through, quality is defined by what the customer needs. In this instance, it's appealing TV shows. So they need to differentiate themselves. Clearly, therefore, their capacity to produce more differentiating TV shows is a key lead indicator, a key organisational effectiveness component for their future success. So they're acquiring more studios and sources of high quality content. We also discussed the more online activity. So they also moved to subscription as well to remove the ads. Acquisitions, anything else? Anything else that they were doing? Yes? In which area? And indeed, what was the point of the IPO? So the point of the IPO was to generate more revenues to enable them to increase their acquisitions. So it was a financial decision as opposed to a competitiveness increasing component of the strategy. All right, so basically they're building up their existing business. Were they doing anything like internationalising or competing in different markets or coming up with complementary products and services? No. Supposed to be nothing. Okay. Oh, still can't get those keys to work properly. All right, so we see that they weren't really doing anything new, they were just doing more of the same. Okay, all right, so does this address the key opportunities? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Maybe. What's the real problem here? So yeah, all right. So they don't really know what the key opportunities are, do they? So what might you imagine a key opportunity was for them? Yeah, go more global. So Downton Abbey is so popular in the UK maybe they should have been shipping it more internationally. So if you look at the competitor product, Doctor Who, when they have their new series out, this is just a total global franchise. It's, they've got all sorts of drama around it. The launch of the new series, they launch it simultaneously across the world. It's a big deal. So this organisation hasn't really worked out what its real opportunities are. Is it making the most use of Downton Abbey? Now, clearly it's franchised out and you can see it in other places, but are they pushing it in the same way, or are they they're not making good use? So possibly, certainly changing the online system is just getting it back in line with what people are expecting, which is no ads, and they will pay subscriptions. So that works. That's doing okay, but that's just catching up. Why would it work at all? Because they've actually got a quality differentiated product. They're just not getting it to the market in the right way. So that makes a degree of sense. Does it address the key threats? Does it address the threat that the BBC, which is more successful, could become commercial, in which case, well, okay, so take a step back. Where does a lot of the revenue for ITV come from? Advertising. If the BBC is more successful and they become commercial so that they start accepting advertising, what is likely to happen to ITV? They will lose, yes, they will lose their advertising revenue, which is going to be absolutely the end for them. So, meantime, as we also discussed, Netflix is coming in and selling overseas content in a more attractive and convenient manner. So, does this address the key threats? No. It does not address the key threats. Well, we know that the BBC becoming privatised is a key threat because it will take their advertising. So that hasn't stopped the BBC in any way taking advertising because they haven't changed their content. If the BBC is the more successful of the two, if more people are watching the BBC, then the advertiser is going to go for the BBC unless the BBC is extremely expensive, which is no justification for them doing. So that's a serious threat. Netflix, still better. Is it X? Yeah. Keyboard. So Netflix is still more attractive for overseas, for the people in the UK anyway, because they're better at running online content than ITV, which is not very experienced. So this hasn't really addressed the key threats. What has it done? You might remember we talked before about this idea of punctuated equilibrium, where the organisation continues to improve, but the market or the environment changes faster, and it reaches a point where the gap gets so large that it makes a dramatic change, catches up, and then the environment starts to increase, and it doesn't keep up again until it has to do that again. So in this instance, changing the online system is simply catch up. They've got some good content, and if they get a decent online system, they're sort of where they should have been, but they're not. It doesn't put them ahead of the game. So it hasn't eliminated the threats, it's simply catch up. If they didn't do that, then they would be in strife, because as people move to more and more online content, even online watching, even if their content is really good, if their online capability is no good, then they're just going to lose the market, which means they'll lose the advertising, which means they'll lose their profitability. So all they've done is play catch-up. They haven't eliminated the threat. So it's not looking too good. sort of addresses some key opportunities but doesn't really future-proof the organisation in any way. So suitability, pretty poor. Please come back with some better ideas. Okay, acceptability, we might go to so acceptability, risk return and stakeholder reaction. So let's just do the risk thing first of all. In terms of scenarios, can we think of some scenarios that are likely to result in a negative outcome or a positive outcome? For this current strategy, what is likely to happen? That's the consequence. A scenario is an event that you anticipate could occur. So there was a second local internet-based provider, Hulu, wasn't there? H-U-L-U, which had a fair bit of support, wasn't doing so well. But what happens if the parent companies of that online provider decided they were going to give it a real push because the UK market was a really good market? Then suddenly there's another competitor with more online content. So what's going to happen to, under those conditions, what is going to happen to ITV? Market share is going to be even more squeezed. So scenario, more competition in online. And so that's negative. The future scenario analysis suggests negative outcomes. All right, sensitivity analysis. What's going to happen if their new online platform is still not as good as Netflix? They're assuming that by changing their online platform that people are going to say, great, love your online platform, love your content, we're going to keep watching your stuff and we're going to subscribe and pay for it. But what happens if it's only 90% as good as Netflix or 80% as good as Netflix? Yes, they're going to lose profits. So at best, their new viewer will be as good as what Netflix has to offer. There was no indication in the case that they were going to produce a really good one that did all sorts of fancy stuff like send you an email saying, did you know there's a new series which you're probably going to like to watch? We have preemptively set it up for your viewing on Thursday nights when we notice that you're not too busy. If you want to keep this and try it out, we think you might like it. They don't have anything fancy like that. They're just trying to play catch up, as we've discussed. So at best, the new view will probably be equivalent to Netflix. Who's more capable in creating this online management process? Netflix or ITV? Netflix, because they've got the global scale and they've been in the game a lot longer. And the evidence to date suggests that ITV is not too good at developing their viewer. Even the BBC is ahead. So again, this is based on the assumption that by improving their viewer, they're going to solve the problem of people going to Netflix and BBC. But it's ambitious. It's not certain. The evidence would suggest that they're probably not. It's not going to be as good. So there will be some loss of market. There will be some loss of market because they are going to be very unlikely to turn around this issue. Otherwise, they would have got it right before. So, not looking good. Break-even analysis. Well, do we know anything about this? Let's think. Okay, so the income comes from advertising revenue. Right? They don't make money from the programming, the TV shows. They give the TV shows for free, and they make money from the advertising revenue. Come on, fix it up. Okay, so what are their principal costs? Obviously, they've got lots of infrastructure costs. I'll put it in. Okay, if they spend money on their online system, they acquire more businesses, what is going to happen to this? Which direction will the costs go? Up, yep. Right? Because they're spending more money on doing new things that they used not to do. Because of the sensitivity analysis, and they probably won't do as well in the key thing, the online, what is likely to happen to their income, realistically? So, reality is, unless they can pull a rabbit out of the hat and manage to hang on to all of their market, they're going to lose some advertisers. So their income is going to stay stable or most likely go down. They are planning to spend more money, so their cost is going to go up. So this means that there is going to be some time to pay back. It's going to take some time to pay. Now, if we had the figures, we could work out how long this was going to be. What's the problem here? Remember we talked about payback periods. We had the example of 3.5 years. And if it was software, that's a disaster. If it's a car, it might be okay. If it's something else that goes for 10 years, then it's going to be fine. So, what's the problem? Oops. So how many years do you think the payback period has to be for them to get a reasonable return in the TV industry? 3, did you say? 2 or 3? Yeah, I think so. It's most likely that the world will change quite dramatically over that period of time in their industry. So whatever's going to make things work better now, it's only going to go for a couple of years. We can't really tell at this stage, but it's not looking very good, is it, really, from the payback period perspective? It'd have to be relatively low expenditure and it'd be relatively effective for that to happen. But there's not really much, the case doesn't give you much confidence that it's going to be either cheap or quickly effective. So there's a big question mark about this. Okay, so let's go back. Risk. How are we going to rate the risk? High. Yeah. They're not likely to do it. The return? Low. Okay. Now, I can't remember. Yeah, I did. Stakeholder reactions. Let's have a look at this. Work organisation. Is this going to be a problem for work organisation? More acquisitions, updating the viewer. Is this going to be a big change to work organisation? Very disruptive? I'm getting nods. Why is that? Okay. Good, all right. Now they have been doing a fair bit of that, so it mayn't be quite as bad as it could be, but yes, there's certainly that. All right, rewards. Are they in a position to reward this? No, not intrinsically. So not going to be so easy to do. I don't know why the font's different. All right. Relationships. Is that going to affect the relationships in any particular way with their stakeholders, customers, suppliers? Maybe. Yeah, it could. What would be an example of how it could affect the chain, affect the relationships? Yeah, I missed some of that. I'm going to have to come over. Actually, I'm going to give you the microphone. The noise levels are too great up the front.
I'm just saying, if they don't do well with acquisitions and stuff, then they would lose confidence of stakeholders and customers as well.
Yep. All right. So the acquisitions, yeah. Okay. So certainly if they mess up some of the acquisitions, if they mess up some of the partnerships, then it's going to affect their ability to, the perception of them being, doing the right thing. So, oops, a lot of this is unsuccessful there. All right. Training and development. Yeah, probably not much. Recruitment and promotion. Probably again, there's not really much of a change. So, all right. So we've got possible disruption due to acquisition of business units. Probably not much in the way of ability to reward or change there. But if they're not successful, and it seems to be sort of industry where they try out partnerships, they try out things and they don't work and they move on, so they could lose confidence in a challenging time. So the feasibility, some disruptions, some risk of loss of confidence, probably reasonably feasible, I would say. Do you think? Stakeholder reactions. What's gone wrong here? Okay. Not really much resistance. Why not too much resistance? What's another way of putting this? Better than doing nothing, and it's not really, they're not rocking the boat terribly. They're just making some improvements. We normally acquire business units, we'll acquire a few more studios, that'll make us stronger. Yeah, it's steady. It's a bit steady as it goes. Oh, we've got to improve one of our things, our online player. Okay, sounds reasonable. You've already got one. It's not like you're going to, suddenly enter the Chinese market and try and produce Chinese films in the UK for the Chinese market. Did anyone ever try and do that? That sort of thing? That sort of crazy idea? Well, in fact, they did. The Italians were very good at producing westerns for a while. They produced lots of western movies. So some of the most famous, western things with the American West were all produced in Italy. And why? Because they were quite good at making films, and they were cheaper than producing them in the US. So they were actually very successful in creating, films like The Good, Bad, The Ugly. Those films, which are extremely well known, were actually produced in Italy. So they were very successful. They made a lot of money. So it is possible to do something a bit left field, but to this day it seems very surprising that it was done. And so stakeholder reaction to this day, if the Italian film industry said, we're going to go back and we're going to make some more westerns again, everyone would say, what are you doing? You know, you can't be successful at that. It's all wrong. But yet they were. So, they're not trying to do anything as extreme as that, and hence there won't be much resistance. So, why is there limited resistance given that we've said the risk is high and the return is low? How can those things be? What is it about this that has meant that there won't be so much resistance, even though we don't think it's likely to work, and the return is likely to be low? They're not planning to spend much. It's not a threat to the organisation. Not the strategy isn't a threat. The environment is, but the actual strategy to spend some more money on their software, to acquire a couple of more business units, a couple more studios, it's not a lot of money for them. So it doesn't threaten the viability of the organisation seriously. As a project, it may not look very attractive, but as an organisational threat, it's not. So there's tolerance. Oh, well, try it, see how you go. It's not really going to disrupt anything very much. It's going to be business as usual. You're not spending too much money. Sounds reasonable. So it's a low outlay, high risk, low return project. And that's the most important thing there. If they said that we're going to shut down and sell off half of our operations because we're going to invest in Chinese studios and we're going to enter into a partnership with Huawei and distribute across China, then everyone would say, whoa, hang on a second, half the value of the organisation and you've got no capacity to manage internationally. This is high risk, possibly high return, but critically dangerous for the organisation if it's not successful because you're spending half of the total assets on this. So that's the difference. Even though the Chinese example might be more attractive because the return could be very high, even though the risk is high, the threat to the organisation is also high. So then it becomes unattractive. The stakeholders will react negatively. Or half of us are going to lose our jobs, the other half, their jobs are at risk. This has got a lot of problems associated with it, so there will be a lot of negative reaction to that. Whereas here, no one's going to lose their jobs. It's just some management activities, some acquisitions. No one will really notice it. They're in the game of changing the software anyway, so no one's going to notice that. So there's no real impact. So the stakeholders just see it as a small iteration. The only real negative response might be that stakeholders might say, it might say too little too late. You know, you're behind the game and this is all you're doing. We need a bit more. Okay, so in short, suitability, and I put up in the top corner there, if you can see it, where is it? Over there in the top corner. Is that readable? Anyway, I can make it bigger. Ooh, that didn't work too well. Oh, I see why. All right, so maybe that's a little more legible, slightly larger. Okay, so is the proposal, does it address the opportunities or threats the organisation faces? And the answer is? To some degree. You're very positive. You could have also said not really. Yep. Okay, acceptability. Does the strategy meet the expectations of stakeholders? Yes. Is the level of risk acceptable? Low, yes. Is it the return likely to be acceptable? No. Will the stakeholder reactions be positive? they're probably going to be neutral. Okay, not really much going on here, either way. All right, so feasibility. Would a proposed strategy work in practice? Yeah. Can the strategy be financed? Probably. Do the people and skills exist? Yes. Can the required resources be retained? So, yes, it's feasible. So, what we have here is a good example of something that you can implement pretty easily, and it's not dramatic. Were the organisation, were ITV to do something dramatic and failed, then that would be the end. In this instance, whilst it's not very exciting and it's probably just going to like hold off some of the losses of sales, but not change things, it does give the organisation some breathing space to review. So if there was a larger strategy conversation about internationalisation, about using their studio resources to do materials for other countries, maybe Europe, particularly as the UK exits Europe, it might make continental Europe more of a market for it. Then this might be a really good idea because it might take them 5 years to really develop this market and work out what it's supposed to be about. So it could be the first part of a larger effective strategy, and they need to take these actions now to give them enough time to plan for and implement a bigger strategy. So therefore it has potential to be valuable. If, however, all they do is this, then all they have done is hold off the inevitable, and at best, okay, I suppose given their staff a few more years of employment, but also created a false expectation around the long-term prosperity of the organisation. So in the case of the shareholders, they would criticise them as providing false signals to the market. Yep, we're doing things, we're making changes, you can continue to invest in us. But we actually know the changes really won't, or we should have known the changes won't make a big difference, so we've given you a bit of a false signal there. So sometimes organisations intentionally do that. They're in trouble, they don't know what to do, they know that the immediate thing they're going to face before they go out of business is that the shareholders are going to start to make life miserable, so they'll spend money so they can show something, and that will give a false signal to the market. They'll go and buy a whole lot of technology and they'll say, we've just spent $1 billion in technology in response to our loss of market share. And then the shareholders will say, oh, that's good. Okay, they're spending money, they're doing something, and then they'll relax. Now, companies will just do this simply to give the shareholders a false message to say, look, we're doing something. There's no particular reason to invest in that. It's not going to make a difference, but it's an action that sends out a message. So in many cases, organisations are very concerned about the message that their actions give to the shareholders, and they're quite careful to make sure that it doesn't create problems, because the shareholders are the quickest, the most reactive aspect that they'll face. Their competitors and the rest of the market are usually slower. The shareholders can change their mind every 3 months on the basis of quarterly returns. And that you can go from positive shareholders to negative shareholder sentiment, calls for the CEO to lose their job and so forth in the space of 3 months. So organisations that are listed are frequently very concerned about the messages that they give. So on one hand, this gives a message to the, it's steady as it goes and will provide some short-term remedial benefit. On the other hand, there's also the issue that it provides a message to the market, to the shareholders, that will not about an improvement that won't really last very long, and they'll fairly quickly see that it has a limited effect. Okay, so it could be a bit of an issue there. All right, and so that brings us to the end. That is slide 6. So that brings us to the end. We've got a little bit of time. We've managed to finish a bit early today. It's a relatively compact topic for this week. So does anyone have any questions about the assignment or observations about today's topic? Okay, so next week we're going to look at design, strategy design and assessment. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where did I have it? Oh, we just had it on this. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah, yep. Sorry, yep. Yep. Well, that's a good question. So let's go back to the example I gave of the municipal government saying we've got to do rubbish pickup twice per week because people's healths are at risk. We've done a break-even analysis. Sorry, I can't remember which way was it. Was it sensitivity analysis was okay and break-even analysis not? Yeah. So we've done a break-even analysis. We're going to save in medical expenses because of health. We're going to save $500,000 per year. But this is going to cost us $1 million per year, so it's never going to pay for itself. From a sensitivity analysis, yeah, we know what we're doing. There's not much variation in this. We're pretty capable, even if things don't go quite as well, but within reasonable variation, it's still going to look the same. Right? We're still going to manage to get all the rubbish collected. There's not a problem with our ability to perform in that. We know the costs intimately. Yeah, they could vary by 10%, but it's not going to make any real difference. We're still able to do it. So sensitivity analysis, yes, this will be a successful project, but from a break-even perspective, it's going to cost us. We cannot make a profit out of this by virtue of the outgoings versus the income. If we try and look at this as a public good versus expense, and we try and quantify the public good, not just in terms of money saved from health issues, but we put a value on public good, even at the most ambitious sort of value of it, it's still going to be more expensive than the public good that's created. So we've got this situation where we can't justify it on economic terms or socio-economic terms. It's not going to provide as much good as or value as it's going to cost us, but we're pretty confident about how it's going to come out. And even if we take our most negative likely performance, then it's still going to look pretty okay, but not economically or socially attractive. So. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're not going to do it, or we're going to do it? Well, then they need to look at the overall cost. Okay, and so so this is an extra $500,000. Now, the municipality currently turns over $200 million per year. So this is, I was going to say, is it 0.5%? No, it's 0.25%. This is 0.25% of our overall revenue. 0.25% of our overall revenue. So, reality is that we normally have a surplus of at least $5 million per year. So this is going to cut that down from $5 million to $4.5 million. There is no question that having the rubbish collected twice a year and the residents' concerns about there being rodents and things running around and people getting sick, they will feel like we've done something positive. So there will be a positive stakeholder reaction to this, even though from a value-creating perspective we can't justify it. From a stakeholder engagement perspective we can. And most importantly, in this instance, it's only 5% of revenue, well, no, what did I say? 2.5% of revenue. So it's not 2.5%, 0.25% of revenue. So it's not a significant financial impact. So we're going to do this thing because of the publicity aspect, even though we make a loss. In the same way that organisations that make investment in corporate social responsibility might say, you know what, we can't generate the goodwill from this that the cost justifies. But we're spending 0.1% of our revenue on our corporate social responsibility. And in the long term, it's pretty obvious that it's going to provide some general benefit, even though we can't quantify it as an internal benefit. So again, irrespective of the sensitivity analysis, the break-even's not there, but the cost impact is low enough that we can do it because intrinsically it's a good idea. So if it was 10% of revenue and you couldn't break even, then you would be realistically saying, is this the best place for us to be spending our money? If it's 10% of our revenue and it's not creating as much public value as the cost that we have to pay, then are we making good use of our money? Or should we be doing something else? Should we be building more parks? Should we be improving street safety? Should we be putting cameras out, more street lighting, something like that? Would that be a better use? Because we're getting down to a significant cost. But where it's very small, it becomes quite, whether or not you do it becomes quite arbitrary and the conditions aren't the same. So it's the absolute amount or the impact or your ability to get it wrong. See, if they got it wrong, that would also be disaster. If they created the expectation that the rubbish would be collected twice per week, but then they didn't do it most weeks because they were overly ambitious about their ability to mobilise a fleet or deal with the traffic or something, then creating the expectation, not delivering it, would be a distinct issue. But if they had confidence in their ability to deliver it, even if things varied a bit, and it wasn't a significant cost, but it wasn't viable, then they can still choose to do it, just as a characteristic of the organisation. So you've always got to balance up several things, but for me, the number one thing is, can you afford the risk? And if the answer is yes, it's actually financially quite not very challenging for the organisation at all, it puts it into a very different category, where it still has to compete in terms of value creating, but you can be a little more relaxed with your assessment. Whereas if it's a significant investment for the organisation, then it has to provide a significant benefit. And if it was 10% of the revenue of even a municipal government or municipal authority, it was 10% of their revenue, they would probably have to still show that it was economically viable as well as socially viable, because they still couldn't justify that sort of expense at a negative, that sort of negative expense outcome or that negative economic outcome, even if there was a good social good attached to it. So it's the magnitude as well as the return that I think are the key things, and it really just comes down to the cost to the organisation relative to the value, and whether it's a financial value or a social value. You know, the things are actually, these days it's quite possible to use you know, demographic projections and things to get quite accurate figures for these. Again, if it's a minor activity, then you are a bit more relaxed about the criteria you use, and if it's a major activity, then you really have to be very accurate about the figures you use. So you might use, if it's a minor thing, then for value you might just use public sentiment. Yeah, we did an interview of 20 people and all of them were either positively or very positively disposed towards this project. So we're going to call this high value. And that's enough because it's only a small cost. But if it was a big cost, then you would have to try and go much further and work out what the real, use a whole lot of socio-economic measures of the real value that was likely to be created. Does that answer your question? Good. Anything else? No? Great. All right. The assignment marking is underway, so we're making good progress in that. I normally like to have it back within 2 weeks. The main issue tends to be as to whether how much moderation we need to do. Sometimes I find that we need to do a fair bit of a revision of the assignment marking to look at the different groups and be fair to all groups. Other times everyone's pretty consistent. They do the same sort of assignments, and the assessment is fairly straightforward. So that will be the only question as to why we don't get it back in 2 weeks. Otherwise, you should have it within 2 weeks. Good. Thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you all again next week. Is it week 9 next week, isn't it? Yeah, week 9. So we're rushing through the trimester. So I hope you all have a good week. The weather's a bit miserable for the weekend, but anyway, I will see you all next week. Thanks a lot.